the day Vivian said it out loud. I was standing in my own living room, in front of my husband's altar. The incense had just caught. 3 thin sticks, the kind Edward always preferred, sandalwood, not the cheaper ones, and the smoke was still finding its shape, curling upward in the afternoon light the way it had every day for the 4 months since I lost him. The photograph on the altar showed Edward at 61, the year before his first stroke, when he still smiled with his whole face. I had chosen that photo myself. I wanted to remember him before the illness took the easy things. First, his laugh, his appetite, the way he used to hum while reading the newspaper. Vivian had come with Marcus. They always came together now, the 2 of them moving through my house like they owned the floor plan. She was dressed in a cream blouse, pressed, professional. The kind of woman who irons her collars on weekday mornings and calls it discipline. Marcus stood half a step behind her, the way he had stood behind her for years, my firstborn son, 44 years old, and somehow smaller every time I saw him. There were others in the room. My neighbor Mrs. Sloan from next door, who had come to help me sort through Edward's pension paperwork. A young woman from the insurance office, someone Vivian had brought along and introduced with a name I immediately forgot, because her eyes never met mine, and my second son, Daniel, who had flown in from Singapore 2 days earlier, sitting now on the far end of the sofa with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. I remember the light. Late afternoon, the kind that turns everything amber and slow. A ceiling fan moved the air just enough to make the incense smoke bend sideways, then recover. Vivian opened the folder she had been carrying. "Mother," she said. And the word landed the way it always did from her, not warm, not cold exactly, but precise, like a key inserted into a lock she wasn't sure she had the right to turn. The insurance company confirmed it. Dad changed the beneficiary himself, 6 months before he passed. That's just what he wanted. She paused. And then she said the rest of it. Maybe he knew you wouldn't be around much longer either, and he wanted to make sure the money stayed in the family. The room went very still. Mrs. Sloan made a small sound, half breath, half something else. Daniel uncrossed his arms. The young woman from the insurance office looked down at the folder in her own lap. I looked at Vivian. She met my eyes steadily, the way people do when they have rehearsed a thing many times and believe the rehearsal has made them right. I smiled. Not the polite smile I had learned from 34 years of nursing that particular expression, the one you give to families in waiting rooms when you cannot say what you know. This was something quieter, something older than politeness. I did not say anything. Vivian seemed to expect a response. Some resistance, perhaps. Tears. The trembling hands of a 68-year-old woman who has just been told that her husband of 41 years had made arrangements she knew nothing about. She had prepared for that. I could see it in the way she held the folder ready to produce documents, to explain, to reassure me in the tone one uses with people who are already losing their grip on things. But I only smiled, and looked back at the incense smoke, and waited. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mom, we just want everything handled properly, for everyone." I nodded once. "I know," I said. And that was all. They stayed another 20 minutes. Vivian explained the claim process, the timeline, the figures, $240,000. The policy Edward had held for 19 years. Since the year Daniel was born, and Edward had sat across from a life insurance agent with the expression of a man who was thinking about futures he might not live to see. Vivian said the beneficiary change had been processed 8 months ago. She said the paperwork was in order. She said the insurance company had already verified everything. She said all of this in the amber light of my living room, in front of my husband's altar. While the sandalwood smoke moved between us, I listened to every word. When they finally left Vivian first, then Marcus, then the young woman who still had not looked at me, Daniel stayed behind. He sat in the chair across from me and did not speak for a long time. "Did you know?" he asked eventually. "About any of it?" "No," I said. He nodded slowly. "I didn't either." We sat together in the quiet of the house after everyone had gone. The incense had burned low. The photograph of Edward looked back at us from the altar, calm and unchanged and entirely his own. I thought about the evening, 3 weeks before Edward's second hospitalization, when he had sat across from me at the kitchen table after dinner, the way he always did, and had said something that I had turned over in my mind many times since, without fully understanding it. He had said, "I want you to check on the policy, Hazel. The original one? Make sure you know where it is." I had said, "Edward, you're not going anywhere." He had smiled at that, his real smile, the one that started at the left corner, and had not said anything more. I had not checked on the policy that night, nor the next. There had been appointments, medication schedules, the particular exhaustion of watching someone you love moving slowly towards something you cannot stop. A retired nurse knows better than most what that trajectory looks like. I had known, and I had loved him, and I had spent those last weeks beside him instead of searching through filing cabinets. But I knew where the original was. I had always known. Edward had told me exactly where he put it 22 years ago, on the evening he brought it home, behind the photograph on the altar shelf. In the envelope he had sealed himself. He had said, "If anything happens to me, Hazel, start there." I had asked, "Why there?" He had said, "Because you'll always go there first." He was right. I had gone there the morning after he died, before the sun was fully up, before the neighbors arrived with food and condolences and the complicated grief of people who did not know what to do with their hands. I had gone there alone, in the dark of the altar room, and I had touched the back of the shelf and felt the envelope still in its place, exactly as he had left it. I had not opened it then. I was not ready. But I knew it was there. There is a saying my mother used to speak in the evenings, when she thought my sister and I were already asleep, and her voice would come through the thin wall between rooms like something meant only for the night air. Still water gives no warning before it breaks the dam. I had been still water all my life. 34 years of clinic nursing teaches you that. The families who shout in hospital corridors are not the ones you watch most carefully. You watch the ones who go quiet, the ones who sit in the plastic chairs and fold their hands and say almost nothing, because they are the ones who have already decided what comes next. Vivian had looked at me that afternoon and seen a grieving old woman. She had seen exactly what she needed to see, and I had let her. Edward built the altar shelf himself. That is the thing I think about when I stand in front of it now. Not the photograph, not the incense, not the small ceramic cup we used for water offerings, but the shelf itself. The wood he had chosen from a lumber yard on a Saturday morning 31 years ago, when we had just moved into this house and everything in it still smelled like fresh paint and the particular hope that comes with owning something for the first time. He had taken half the day selecting the right piece. I had stood beside him in the yard, a woman of 37 with paint on her forearm and a list of other things we needed to do, and I had watched him run his hand along plank after plank with the patience of someone who understood that certain decisions, made once, last a lifetime. He was right about the wood. It had lasted. We had lived in this house for 31 years, long enough for the floorboards in the hallway to learn the sound of our particular footsteps, long enough for the kitchen window to fog every winter in exactly the same corner, where the old sealant had softened and never been replaced because Edward always said he would get to it in the spring, and spring always brought other things. Long enough for the frangipani tree in the side yard to grow taller than the roofline, so that on still afternoons its scent came through the louvers and settled into the rooms the way a memory does, uninvited, precise, and not entirely welcome when it finds you unprepared. I had been a clinic nurse for 34 years, day shifts mostly, though in the early years I worked whatever the schedule required, nights, weekends, the long holiday stretches when the other nurses with young children needed to be home. I did not mind. Work had always made sense to me in a way that other things sometimes did not. A patient in front of you, a need that could be assessed, addressed, recorded, the satisfaction of leaving a shift knowing that what you had done was real and measurable and good. Edward was a civil engineer. He spent his career building things that other people walked across and drove over and never thought about: drainage systems, road foundations, the invisible infrastructure beneath visible life. He was proud of that, though he rarely said so directly. He expressed pride the way he expressed most things. Quietly, through attention to detail, through the care he put into doing ordinary things well. We had met at a clinic. Not as patient and nurse, he had come to collect his younger sister after a minor procedure, and had arrived early, and had sat in the waiting area reading a newspaper with the particular stillness of a man who did not find silence uncomfortable. I had noticed him because most people in waiting rooms are restless. They check their phones, they shift in their seats, They make the small movements of people who are somewhere they do not want to be. Edward sat as if he had nowhere else to be and had decided this was fine. I brought his sister out when she was ready. He stood, folded his newspaper, and thanked me with a formality that was not unfriendly, just careful. Like the wood he would choose years later, taking his time to find the right thing. We were married 11 months after that. Marcus came first, in the second year. Daniel came 3 years later. 2 boys who grew into 2 men, which is its own kind of project, one that takes longer, and has fewer clear milestones than anything Edward ever built. I nursed them through fevers and arguments, and the particular silences of adolescence. Edward coached their soccer on weekend mornings until they were old enough to inform him, with the cruelty unique to teenage sons, that they no longer wanted him on the sideline. He had taken that with good humor, or something that looked like good humor, which, with Edward, was often the same thing. The house absorbed all of it. The noise of boys, the quieter years after they left, the gradual settling that happens when 2 people have lived together long enough to stop explaining themselves and simply exist in the same space with the comfort of the understood. Saturday mornings with coffee, and the newspaper he still read in print because he distrusted reading on screens. The habit he had of leaving his reading glasses in 4 specific places, and only those 4, so that I always knew where to look. The way he hummed while he was thinking, a low, tuneless sound that I had found mildly irritating for the first decade, and would give almost anything to hear again now. When his first stroke came, 5 years ago, it was mild enough that we told ourselves it was a warning, and not a beginning. He recovered most of what he had lost. His speech came back fully. His right hand was slower than it had been, but he adapted. He always adapted. It was one of the things I had loved about him from the beginning, his ability to take the altered version of a thing and find a way to work with it, rather than mourning the original. The second stroke, 2 years later, was less kind. After that, I retired. It was not a difficult decision. The clinic had been good to me for 34 years, and 34 years was enough. Edward needed more attention than he would ever ask for, and I was a nurse, and he was my husband, and the arithmetic of that was simple. I cared for him at home, with help 3 mornings a week from an aide named Phuong, who was efficient and gentle, and who Edward liked because she never talked more than the situation required. The last year was slower. Not painful, I want to be clear about that. We had made decisions, he and I, years before, about how we wanted things to go at the end, and those decisions had been honored. He was at home. He was not afraid. In the final weeks, when he slept more than he was awake, I would sit in the chair beside the bed and hold his hand, and sometimes he would squeeze back, and sometimes he would not, and both were all right. He died on a Tuesday morning, just after dawn. I had been awake since 4. Some instinct, the same one that had gotten me out of bed in the night for 34 years of nursing, pulling me toward the room before I understood why. I had sat with him as the light came through the curtains and changed from gray to pale gold. And when it was over, I had stayed for a long time before I did anything else, because there are endings that deserve stillness before they become paperwork. I had gone to the altar room that same morning. Before I called anyone, before the day became the thing it was about to become, the envelope was there, exactly where Edward had placed it. I did not open it, but I pressed my hand flat against the shelf he had built, the wood smooth and cool beneath my palm, solid in the way of things made to last, and I stayed like that for a moment, with the frangipani scent coming through the window and the house breathing quietly around me. It was only later, when Marcus called to say that Vivian would be handling the insurance claim, that I felt the first small thread of something I could not yet name pull loose inside my chest. Not alarm. Not yet. But something. The phone call came on a Thursday. I knew it was Thursday because I had just come back from the market, the small one 2 streets over where I had been buying vegetables since before Marcus was born. The woman who ran the produce stall knew me by name. Knew that I preferred the smaller eggplants. Knew that I would always stop to examine the ginger before buying it regardless of how long the line was behind me. It was the kind of ordinary morning that grief allows, sometimes the hours that feel almost like before, until something shifts, and you remember again. I had set my basket on the kitchen counter and was washing the morning glories when my phone rang. The number was local, but not one I recognized. Mrs. Nguyen? A woman's voice, professional and practiced. This is Linda Pham calling from Pacific Trust Life Insurance. I'm reaching out regarding policy number PT1987HN, held under the name Edward Nguyen. I turned off the tap. Yes, I said. That's my husband's policy. A brief pause. The kind that is not accidental. I see, she said. I'm calling to inform you that a claim has been filed on this policy. The claim was submitted by the listed primary beneficiary, a Mrs. Vivian Nguyen. I stood in my kitchen with wet hands and the morning glories dripping into the sink, and I did not say anything for a moment, because 34 years of nursing had taught me that the first response to unexpected information should never be the loudest one. I wasn't aware a claim had been filed, I said finally. The paperwork was submitted last week, Linda Pham said. Everything appears to be in order. I'm calling as a courtesy, because our records show that you were the original beneficiary on file prior to the change. Prior to the change. 4 words arranged in a sequence that was meant to sound administrative and neutral. The way all devastating things sound when they have been processed through enough paperwork. When was the beneficiary changed? I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. 8 months ago, Mrs. Nguyen. The form was submitted in person at our district office and notarized on site. 8 months ago. Edward had still been alive 8 months ago. Weaker than the year before, moving more slowly, sleeping longer in the afternoons, but alive, and present, and himself in all the ways that mattered. We had eaten dinner together every evening. I had read to him on the nights his eyes tired too quickly for the page. He had still been the man who hummed while thinking, who left his glasses in the same 4 places, who said my name the way he always had Hazel, as if it were a complete sentence. I'll need to see the documentation, I said. Of course. I can mail copies to your address on file, or you're welcome to come to the office directly. Mail them, I said. Please. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The morning glories were still in the sink. Outside, the frangipani tree moved in a small wind, its branches scraping lightly against the side of the house, a sound I had heard so many times it had become part of the silence rather than a disturbance of it. 8 months ago, I went to my bedroom and opened the small wooden box I kept on the dresser. Edward had given it to me on our 20th anniversary teak, with a simple brass latch, the kind of object that asks nothing of you except that you keep it. Inside, I stored things that required safekeeping. Our marriage certificate, the children's birth records, my nursing license, property documents. And at the bottom, beneath everything else, a single folded paper, a photocopy of the insurance policy I had made the year Edward first took it out. Because I was a woman who believed in keeping copies of important things, I unfolded it. Primary beneficiary, Hazel Nguyen. Soul. He refolded it and put it back. That evening, Marcus came by. He said he was checking in, which was what he said whenever Vivian had sent him to do something she preferred not to do herself. I had learned to read the difference between Marcus arriving because he wanted to and Marcus arriving because he had been instructed to. It was in the way he moved through the doorway, too deliberate, too purposeful, the body language of a man running a rehearsed errand. He sat at the kitchen table. I made tea. We talked about ordinary things for a while, the way families do when they are building towards something they have not said yet. Then he said it. Mom, Vivian mentioned the insurance company may have called you. I set down my cup. She did, yes, I said. He nodded, looking at the table rather than at me. She just wanted to make sure you weren't confused by it. The process can be complicated. She thought it might be easier if she handled everything, the paperwork, the claim, all of it. So you don't have to deal with it during such a hard time. Such a hard time. I looked at my son, my firstborn, the child who had once fallen asleep on my shoulder during a long bus journey, and had smelled of baby shampoo and the particular sweetness of small children in deep sleep, and I thought about how easy it is for a person to become an instrument of someone else's purpose without fully fleeing on. Understanding that is what they have become. Your father and I held that policy for 19 years, I said. I know, Mom. I was the beneficiary for all 19 of those years. He looked up then. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the near neighbor of it. The expression of a man who has been told one version of a story and is beginning to sense, in a place he has not yet examined, that the version might be incomplete. The change was legal, he said. The words came out slightly too fast. Vivian checked with the insurance company. Everything was properly filed. I'm sure it was, I said. I smiled at him the same way I had smiled at Vivian the day before in the living room. The same way my mother had smiled at people who underestimated still water. He left an hour later, looking slightly less certain than when he had arrived. After the door closed, I went to the altar room. The envelope was still behind the photograph, where Edward had placed it. I did not touch it. I stood in front of the altar with the last of the evening light coming through the window and the incense ash cold in its holder, and I looked at my husband's photograph, and I thought about what he had said to me on the last good evening we had together. One of those rare nights when his mind was sharp and the pain was quiet, and we had sat together on the back step the way we used to, watching the sky go dark. He had said, "Hazel, if anything happens with the policy, if anyone tells you something has changed, go to the office yourself. Don't let anyone go for you." I had asked him what he meant. He had looked at me steadily, the way he looked at things he had already decided about. He had said, "I mean exactly what I said." I had not understood it then. I had thought it was the kind of worry that comes with illness, the mind circling back to practical concerns as a way of managing what cannot be managed. I had held his hand and told him everything was taken care of and not thought about it again. Until now. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then I went to find Daniel's number and sat down to call my second son. The one who had come from Singapore and crossed his arms and said nothing while Vivian spoke. The one who had asked me afterward, quietly, whether I had known about any of it. I had something to ask him, and I suspected, from the careful way he had sat in silence that afternoon, that he might have something to tell me too. Daniel answered on the second ring. He was still awake, which told me something. It was past 9, and Daniel had always been an early sleeper, a habit left over from the years of early morning flights and the particular exhaustion of a man who spent his working life moving between time zones. If he was awake at 9 in the evening, he had not been sleeping well. I understood that. I had not been sleeping well either. "Mom," he said. Just that. The way children say the word when they already know something is coming and have decided they are ready for it. "I need to ask you something," I said. "I know." I sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet around me in the way it had been quiet since Edward died, not the comfortable quiet of before, when silence meant we were simply in different rooms, going about the ordinary business of a shared life. This was a different kind, the kind that has weight. "The insurance company called me today," I said. "A woman named Linda Pham. She told me the beneficiary was changed 8 months ago." "I heard," Daniel said. "Did Vivian tell you?" A pause. "Marcus did. This afternoon, after he got back from your place." "And what did Marcus say?" "He said it was legal, that everything was properly filed." Another pause, longer. "He said Vivian had checked." I looked at the surface of the kitchen table, the same table where Edward and I had eaten 31 years of meals, where the boys had done homework and argued and grown into themselves by slow degrees. There was a small mark near the edge where Daniel had once set down a soldering iron, at the age of 16, during a period when he was convinced he was going to build his own radio. The mark had never come out. Edward had sanded it lightly and said nothing. I had always loved him for that. "Daniel," I said. 8 months ago. Think carefully. Where was your father 8 months ago? Silence. Then, Mom. Think. I heard him exhale. A long, slow breath. The kind that means a person is putting something together that they had been keeping in separate pieces because the assembled version was too large to look at directly. "He was in the hospital," Daniel said quietly. "The second week of March. The thanks in advance. They kept him for 12 days. "Yes," I said. His right hand couldn't hold a pen properly for 3 weeks afterward. Dr. Albert Tran's notes say the fine motor weakness lasted until early April. I had read those notes many times. Nurses keep records. It is not a professional habit, it is a survival one. The beneficiary change form was notarized on March 14th. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a space completely. The way water fills a shape taking on the exact dimensions of what contains it. "That's not possible," Daniel said. "No," I said, "it isn't." After we finished talking, I sat at the table for a while longer. Then, I went to the bedroom and opened the small teak box. I took out the photocopy of the original policy and set it on the table in front of me. I had looked at it that afternoon, but now I looked at it differently. Not as a document I already knew, but as evidence. Primary beneficiary: Hazel Nguyen. Sole. No secondary beneficiary listed. Edward had been deliberate about that. I remembered the evening he had come home with the policy documents, 19 years ago. He had sat across from me at this same table and gone through each page with the methodical attention he brought to all things that mattered to him. When he reached the beneficiary section, he had said, "Just you, Hazel, that's the only arrangement that makes sense to me." I had not argued. It had made sense to me too. The next morning, I called Linda Pham back. She answered efficiently, the way insurance office staff do: name, department, a tone that is professional without being warm. I told her I would like to come in person to review the documentation on file. She said that was perfectly fine, that she could see me Thursday afternoon. I wrote down the address and the time, then I asked her one question. The beneficiary change form that was submitted 8 months ago, was it submitted in person or by mail? In person, she said, without hesitation. At our district office, notarized on-site by our staff notary. And the notary, do they retain their own records? A brief pause, slightly longer than the pauses she had used the day before. Our notary keeps a logbook, yes. Standard practice. I'd like to see that as well, I said. She said she would see what she could arrange. I thanked her and hung up. I spent the rest of that morning doing what I had learned to do in 34 years of nursing whenever I was dealing with something complicated. I made a list. Not of feelings, not of theories, but of verifiable facts. Dates, times, documents, names. The kind of list that has no room for what you think or fear, or want to believe, only what you can confirm. March 14th. Beneficiary change form submitted and notarized at Pacific Trust Life District Office. March 9th through March 21st. Edward Nguyen, admitted to City General Hospital following transient ischemic attack. March 14th through approximately April 6th. Right-hand fine motor weakness documented by Dr. Albert Tran. I looked at the list. A man with documented right-hand weakness, admitted to a hospital, could not have appeared in person at an insurance office on the same day to sign and notarize a legal document changing his policy beneficiary. That was not a theory, it was arithmetic. That afternoon, I went through the filing cabinet in the study, the one Edward had organized himself, in the careful way of an engineer who understood that systems only work when every component is in its right place. I was looking for anything from 8 months ago. Bank statements, correspondence, any record of contact with Pacific Trust Life. I found nothing unusual, which was, itself, unusual. Edward kept everything. But tucked into the back of the folder marked insurance, a folder I had looked through quickly in the days after his death, too tired and too grief-fogged to examine carefully, I found something I had not noticed before. A small piece of paper. Folded twice. Not a document, just a page torn from the small notebook Edward kept by the bed in his final months. The one he used when speaking became effortful and writing was faster. His left-hand writing, the labored but legible script he had developed after the right hand slowed. 4 or 5 words per line, widely spaced, the letters large and deliberate. I unfolded it. He had written 3 things: a date, a name, and a question. The date was 7 months ago, 1 month after the beneficiary change form had supposedly been signed. The name was Raymond Cho, and the question, written in the careful left-hand script of a man who was running out of time and knew it, was this: why did he come here alone? I did not sleep that night. I lay in the bed that Edward and I had shared for 31 years, on my side of it, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about a man named Raymond Cho. I thought about the question written in my husband's careful left-hand script. Why did he come here alone? And I turned it over the way I used to turn difficult cases over during night shifts, examining each surface, looking for the place where the thing made sense. By morning, I had decided what to do next. Dr. Albert Tran's clinic opened at 8. I had known Albert Tran for 11 years, since Edward had first become his patient after the initial cardiac scare that had reorganized our understanding of how we needed to live. He was a careful doctor, the kind who read the full chart before entering the room and remembered details from 6 appointments ago without checking his notes. Edward had trusted him. I trusted him. I called at 8:05. His receptionist put me through without making me wait, which told me Albert had already noted the call as a priority. I had left a message the evening before, brief and factual. I needed to discuss the dates of Edward's March hospitalization and the state of his physical condition during that time. Hazel, Albert said when he came on the line. His voice was the same as always, steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that most things could be discussed calmly if you decided in advance that they could. I've been wondering if you would call. You've been wondering, I said. After Edward passed, I reviewed his full file. There were some things that concerned me, things I wasn't sure were my place to raise. A pause. But if you're asking, then I think you already know something. Tell me about March, I said. The hospitalization, his right hand. And whether, in your professional opinion, Edward Nguyen could have signed a legal document on March 14th. The silence that followed was the kind that contains a complete answer before the words arrive. No, Albert said. He could not have. On March 14th, Edward was in bed 7 of the neurology ward. I saw him myself at 2 in the afternoon. His right hand had no reliable grip. He could not hold a cup without assistance. I have the notes, Hazel. I documented everything. Another pause. Is someone saying he signed something on that date? A beneficiary change form, I said. For the life insurance policy, I heard Albert exhale a slow, controlled breath, the kind that means a person is managing their reaction before they allow it into their voice. That form is fraudulent, he said. Simply, the way a doctor states a diagnosis when the evidence no longer permits uncertainty. Yes, I said. I believe it is. I thanked him and asked if he would be willing to provide a written statement to that effect. He said yes, without hesitation, and told me he would have something prepared by the end of the week. After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the chair beside the window, Edward's chair, the one he had used in the last years when the bed became too confining and he wanted to sit upright and watch the frangipani tree in the side yard. I had not moved it since he died. I did not sit in it often. But that morning I sat in it, and I looked out at the tree, and I thought about what I knew, and what I still did not know. I knew the signature on the beneficiary change form was impossible. I knew Raymond Cho was the insurance agent who had processed the claim. I knew Raymond Cho had come to my house, come here alone. Edward had written at some point in those final months. What I did not know was why, or what had passed between them. That answer came from a direction I had not anticipated. Daniel called at 10 that morning. He had been doing his own searching, he said, going through the contacts on the old phone Edward had used before his condition made smartphones difficult, and they had switched him to a simpler model. The old phone had been in the bedside drawer. Daniel had found it the day he arrived from Singapore, had charged it out of habit or instinct or grief, he was not sure which, and had been going through it slowly in the evenings since. Mom, he said. There are text messages between Dad and Raymond Cho. I held the phone very still against my ear. Read them to me, I said. Daniel read. The first messages were from 10 months ago, ordinary insurance correspondence, the kind of administrative back and forth that accumulates over a long policy. Confirmation of premium payments, a request to update contact information, a notification about a policy anniversary. Nothing unusual. The tone was professional, polite. Then, 9 months ago, the tone changed. Raymond Cho had sent a message that read, Mr. Nguyen, I'd like to discuss some options regarding your policy that may benefit your family. Would it be possible to meet privately? I can come to you. Edward had replied. The next day, come Thursday afternoon. My wife works mornings. Daniel's voice was flat when he read that line. Even in careful, the way voices go when they are carrying something heavy and have decided not to put it down until they reach the end. I worked mornings, that was true. In the months before I retired, I had still been doing half days at the clinic on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Edward had known my schedule precisely. But I had not been working those Thursdays. I had retired by then, which meant either Edward had forgotten possible, given the increasing confusion of his final months, or he had told Raymond Cho I worked mornings because he wanted the meeting to happen without me present, or someone else had told Raymond Cho I would not be there. Keep reading, I said. The messages continued. 3 more from Raymond Cho over the following weeks, each one shorter than the last, confirming Thursday. I'll bring the forms. One final item to review, please don't mention this to anyone until we've had a chance to speak. Then nothing. The conversation simply stopped. Edward had not replied to the last 3 messages. Mom, Daniel said. The last message from Raymond Cho is dated 3 weeks before Dad's thanks in advance. Before the hospitalization, he paused. But the beneficiary change form was notarized 3 weeks after, when Dad was already in the hospital and couldn't sign his own name. The silence between us was complete. Someone else signed it, I said. Yes. And Raymond Cho notarized a signature he knew was not your father's. Daniel did not answer right away. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not intend to go and is now standing in it, looking around. Mom. The messages stopped because Dad stopped responding. He was suspicious. I think he invited Cho to the house to understand what was being proposed, and then he realized what it was, and he stopped engaging. A breath. But by then, someone had already gotten to Cho. Someone who knew Dad's policy number. Someone who had access to his personal information. Only 2 people outside of Edward and myself had ever had access to that information. I had given it to no one. Edward had added both boys to an emergency contact list at the insurance office years ago, a standard precaution. Names, phone numbers. Enough to receive notifications in the event of a claim. Not enough to change a beneficiary, but enough to know the policy number. Enough to call an agent directly. Enough to arrange a private meeting on a Thursday morning when they believed the house would be empty. I set down my phone after Daniel and I finished speaking, and I went to the altar room and I stood in front of Edward's photograph for a long time without the incense and without moving, because some moments do not need ceremony, they only need witness. Then I went back to the kitchen, opened my notebook, and wrote a new name at the top of my list. Not Raymond Cho. The name above his. The name of the person who had given him everything he needed and had been in this house enough times to know exactly when I would not be there, because she had been the one, 3 months before the first Thursday meeting, who had handed me a bouquet of roses on my retirement morning, smiled her careful smile, and said, "You deserve the rest, Mother. You've given enough." I had thanked her. I had believed her. And across the city, in an office that smelled of air conditioning and fresh paperwork, a woman named Linda Pham was pulling a logbook from a shelf at my request, a logbook that would show me the name of the person who had stood beside Raymond Cho on March 14th, in a room where my husband was not present, and signed his name to a document that was never his to sign. I was not afraid of what I would find. I was afraid of how long it had been there, waiting for me to look. I have always been a methodical woman. This is not a quality that announces itself. It does not look like ambition or boldness or the kind of determination that other people can see from across a room. It looks, from the outside, like patience. Like a woman who takes her time. Like someone who is perhaps a little slow, a little cautious, a little too careful for her own good. I had spent 34 years allowing people to think this about me, because, in nursing, as in most things, the woman who appears unhurried is rarely suspected of moving quickly. The morning after Daniel and I spoke, I woke before 5. I lay still for a few minutes in the gray pre-dawn quiet, listening to the house settle around me, the small creaks and shifts of an old structure, the frangipani branch that always tapped the side wall when the wind came from the east. Then I got up, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me. I had 3 things I knew to be true. Edward had not signed the beneficiary change form on March 14th. He had been hospitalized, his right hand weakened, physically incapable of producing a legally valid signature on that date. Albert Tran would confirm this in writing. Raymond Cho had visited my house privately, in the weeks before the hospitalization. Edward had suspected something was wrong. He had written it down. Someone had provided Raymond Cho with Edward's policy number, his personal details, and the knowledge of when the house would be empty. Someone with enough access to do it without arousing suspicion. I wrote Vivian's name in the notebook, underlined it once. Then I closed the notebook and put it in the drawer beneath the kitchen cutlery, where it would look, to anyone who opened that drawer, like nothing more than an old shopping list. My first call that morning was to attorney Clara Pham. I had known Clara's name for some years without knowing her personally. In the way of a small professional community, her reputation had reached me through other channels, a colleague, whose elderly mother had been similarly targeted, a patient from my clinic days, whose family had fought a fraudulent guardianship claim. Clara Pham was the name people used in those situations. Not loudly, not in a way that suggested drama, but with the quiet confidence of people who had needed something serious done and had found the right person to do it. Her assistant put me through that same morning. Clara's voice was direct, without being brusque, the voice of someone who had heard many difficult stories and had learned to receive them without the kind of visible sympathy that can make a person feel fragile. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Nguyen," she said, "what you're describing is insurance fraud, document forgery, possibly elder financial abuse, depending on what the bank records show." Another brief pause. "How much documentation do you currently have in hand?" I told her, the original policy photocopy, Albert Tran's verbal confirmation with a written statement to follow, Edward's text message history with Raymond Cho, and the handwritten note from Edward's bedside notebook. "The handwritten note?" she said. "What does it say exactly?" I read it to her. The date, Raymond Cho's name, the question, why did he come here alone? A silence that had a particular quality, the silence of someone doing calculations. "That note," Clara said carefully, in combination with the medical records and the message history, establishes a timeline that directly contradicts the notarized date on the beneficiary change form. "That's your foundation." She paused. "I need to see everything in person. Can you come to my office this week?" We agreed on Friday afternoon. After I hung up, I sat with my tea and looked out the window at the frangipani tree in the morning light. The blossoms were opening again. They did this in cycles, regardless of season, as if the tree had its own internal calendar that it kept without consulting anyone. Edward had liked to watch them from this window. He said there was something useful about a thing that kept its own time. My mother used to say, "The river does not announce itself before it reaches the sea. It simply moves and arrives." I thought about that now. I thought about Vivian in her pressed cream blouse, speaking with the unhurried confidence of someone who believes they have already won. About Raymond Cho, who had come to this house alone, with forms my husband had refused to sign and had found another way. About the logbook at Pacific Trust Life's district office, sitting on a shelf, containing a record of every notarization performed on that date in March. I was the river. I had always been the river. I simply had not told anyone yet which direction I was moving. The appointment with Linda Pham at Pacific Trust Life was Thursday afternoon. I dressed carefully, not formally but neatly. The dark blue blouse I had worn to professional meetings in my clinic years. Low heels, my reading glasses in my pocket. I wanted to look like what I was. A 68-year-old retired nurse, recently widowed, coming in to understand her late husband's paperwork. Nothing more. Linda Pham was younger than her phone voice had suggested. Mid-30s, organized, with the practiced manner of someone accustomed to managing distressed family members and preferring to do it efficiently. She had a folder prepared. She laid it open on the desk between us. "These are the documents on file regarding the beneficiary change," she said. The original form, the notarization record, and a copy of the identification used to verify the signatory. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the form. The signature was wrong immediately. I had seen Edward's signature thousands of times over 41 years on checks, on documents, on the birthday cards he wrote every year without fail, on the letter he had written to each son when they turned 18. I knew his signature the way I knew his voice, the form of the letters, the particular pressure he put on the first stroke of the capital N, the way his name tilted very slightly upward at the end, as if it were reaching for something. This signature was flat, carefully constructed, not naturally produced. Someone had practiced it. They had gotten the general shape correct. But they had not known about the upward tilt at the end, the small involuntary habit that a person does not even know they have until someone who loves them points it out. I did not say any of this to Linda Pham. I looked at the notarization record next. Notary, Raymond T. Cho. License number. Date, March 14th. And below the notary information, in the field marked witness present, a single name. I read it once, read it again, set the document down on the desk with steady hands. "May I have a copy of this?" I asked. Of course, Linda Pham said. We can print that for you before you leave. I thanked her. I asked a few more questions, unremarkable ones, the kind a grieving widow might ask about claim timelines and processing procedures. I let her believe I was overwhelmed and grateful for her patience. I let her print the copies and put them in an envelope for me. I thanked her again at the door. I walked to my car in the parking lot, and I sat in it for a moment before I started the engine. The witness field on the notarization record had not listed Vivian Nguyen. It had listed a name I had not expected, a name that meant the network was wider than I had understood, that Raymond Cho had not acted in a moment of weakness or greed alone, that this had been arranged with the kind of care that required at least one more person in the room. The name in the witness field was Marcus Nguyen, my son, my firstborn, the one who had sat at my kitchen table 3 days ago and told me, without meeting my eyes, that everything was legal and properly filed. I started the engine. I drove home, and I called Clara Pham before I had even taken off my shoes. They came on a Saturday morning. I had not been warned. There was no phone call the evening before, no message from Marcus asking if he could stop by, none of the small courtesies that families observe when they still believe they owe each other the performance of consideration. They simply arrived Vivian's car in my driveway at 9:30, the engine cutting off, 2 doors opening and closing in the way that suggested purpose rather than visit. I was in the kitchen when I heard them. I had been up since 6, as I had been every morning since Edward died, because grief and early waking have always kept the same hours in my experience. I had already made tea, already sat with my notebook, already reviewed the documents Clara Pham had asked me to organize before our Friday meeting. The folder was in the drawer beneath the cutlery. The notebook was in my pocket. I put the kettle back on before I went to open the door. Vivian entered first. She was dressed as though she had somewhere more important to be afterward, a silk blouse, the color of pale stone, hair arranged, the particular grooming of a woman who understands that appearance is its own form of argument. Marcus came behind her, and behind Marcus came a man I did not recognize. 50s, gray at the temples, carrying a leather briefcase with the practiced ease of someone who carries one every day. Mother, Vivian said, and crossed the threshold without being invited. We should have called ahead. I hope we're not disturbing you. The sentence had the shape of an apology and the substance of nothing. Come in, I said. We went to the living room. I did not offer tea to the man with the briefcase. I offered it to Marcus, because he was my son, and he shook his head without meeting my eyes, which told me everything I needed to know about how much he had slept the night before. This is Mr. Anthony Liu, Vivian said, gesturing to the man with the briefcase. He's an estate attorney. We've asked him to help us manage some of the paperwork around Dad's estate, just to make sure everything is handled correctly. Mr. Anthony Liu smiled at me. It was a professional smile, not unkind, not warm, calibrated precisely for the situation. Mrs. Nguyen, I'm sorry for your loss. Your family has asked me to help facilitate the settlement process. I understand there may have been some confusion recently about the life insurance policy. Confusion. I looked at him, then at Vivian, then at Marcus, who was looking at the floor. Please sit down, I said. We sat. Vivian arranged herself on the sofa with the ease of someone who has rehearsed the staging of a room. Mr. Anthony Liu opened his briefcase on the coffee table, my coffee table, the one Edward and I had bought at a market in the 2nd year of our marriage, before either of us had enough money for furniture that matched, and produced a set of documents clipped together with a large black binder clip. I'll be straightforward with you, he said, sliding the documents across the table toward me. The insurance claim has been filed and is currently being processed. Given the beneficiary designation on file, the proceeds will be distributed to Mrs. Vivian Nguyen as the named primary beneficiary. That process is already underway and should conclude within 2 to 3 weeks. I looked at the documents. I did not touch them. Additionally, he continued, your son Marcus has asked me to review the broader estate situation. There are some matters regarding the property, the house title, the joint savings account that was in both your name and your late husband's that will require attention. We'd like to help streamline that process for you. Streamline. I had been a nurse for 34 years. I had sat in rooms with families and delivered information that rearranged their lives, and I had learned very early that the language people choose when they are taking something from you almost never says taking. It says streamline. It says facilitate. It says we want to make this easier for you, as though the difficulty is the paperwork and not the hand removing something from your possession while you are distracted by the paperwork. What specifically regarding the property? I asked. Vivian leaned forward slightly, just slightly enough to signal that this was the part she had been waiting to arrive at. Mother, the house is large. You're here alone now. Marcus and I have been discussing it, and we think it might be the right time to consider whether this is still the right arrangement for you. Maintaining a house this size, on your own, at your, who paused, selected the word with visible care. At this stage, it's a great deal to manage. At this stage, we've looked into some very comfortable options, she continued. Serviced apartments, some lovely residential communities not far from here. You'd have company, support. You wouldn't have to worry about the maintenance, the bills, I managed a clinic ward for 34 years, I said. The sentence came out quietly. Not sharp. Not raised. Just a fact, placed in the room the way you place a heavy object on a table without drama, but with enough weight that everyone present is aware it has arrived. Vivian smiled, the careful smile. The one she had refined over the years. She had been coming into my house and rearranging it from the inside. Of course, she said. But that was different. You had colleagues then, a structure. Now you're… The pause again, the selected word. Now, you're grieving. And grief affects all of us in ways we don't always recognize in ourselves. I looked at her. She looked back with the composed certainty of someone who has already decided the conversation has only one possible ending. Mr. Anthony Liu cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Nguyen. No decisions need to be made today. We're simply presenting some options for your consideration. What we would ask is that you review these documents. He tapped the clipped papers on the table. There are a few items that would benefit from your signature in the near term. Primarily to clarify the estate administration and ensure that asset management can proceed smoothly during the probate period. I looked at the documents again. The top page was a property management authorization. It bore my name and my address. It would, if signed, grant Marcus and Vivian joint authority to make decisions regarding the house maintenance, rental, and in the event that I chose to relocate, sale. The page beneath it was a limited power of attorney. I looked at both pages for a long moment. Long enough that Mr. Anthony Liu began to recalibrate his expression from patient to something slightly less comfortable. Then I looked up at Vivian. She was watching me with the expression of someone watching a door they believe they have already unlocked. I'll need time to review these, I said. Of course. She stood, straightening her blouse, the silk catching the morning light the way expensive fabric does. We don't want to rush you. We're only trying to help. She looked around the living room then, a slow survey that took in the walls, the furniture, the altar shelf in the corner with Edward's photograph. Her gaze rested there for a moment. Dad would have wanted you taken care of, she said. She said it with perfect softness. It was the cruelest thing she had said since the first day. After they left, I sat in the quiet living room for a long time. The documents were still on the coffee table where Mr. Anthony Liu had left them. I had not touched them. I looked at the altar shelf. Edward's photograph. The cold ash of yesterday's incense. The back of the shelf where the envelope still rested in its place, as it had rested for 19 years, as it would continue to rest until I was ready. My phone was in my pocket. Clara Pham had given me her direct line. I took out the phone and I looked at it, and I thought about the property management authorization and the limited power of attorney sitting on my coffee table, and I thought about Vivian's expression as she had looked at the altar shelf, not grief, not reverence, but the expression of someone calculating the square footage of a room they intend to empty. And I understood then that Friday was too long to wait. I dialed Clara's number. She answered on the second ring. They came this morning, I said. With an estate attorney and documents for me to sign, they want authorization over the house. A silence, brief and precise. Don't sign anything, Clara said. Not one page. I'll move our meeting to tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, I said. And Mrs. Nguyen, do you have a safe place to keep your documents tonight? Everything you've gathered? I looked at the altar shelf, at the photograph, at the back of the shelf where the original envelope waited in the dark, undisturbed, patient in the way of things that have been placed carefully and left to hold their ground. Yes, I said. Good. Don't move them. Don't tell anyone where they are. After we hung up, I went to the kitchen and made fresh tea. I stood at the window looking out at the frangipani tree, and I thought about how certain Vivian had looked sitting on my sofa, how complete her confidence had been, how thoroughly she believed the door was already open. She did not know about the envelope. She did not know about Albert Tran's statement, or Raymond Cho's text messages, or the notarization logbook that carried a name she had not expected me to find. She did not know that the woman she had looked at across a living room and seen as manageable, grieving. At this stage, that woman had spent 34 years reading the vital signs of people who did not know they were being read. But I knew something else now too, something the morning had added to what I already carried. When Mr. Anthony Liu had opened his briefcase on my coffee table, the documents had been arranged in a specific order. The property authorization on top, the power of attorney beneath, standard sequencing for a transaction designed to move quickly. But between those two pages, briefly visible before he had smoothed them flat, there had been a third document, a letter on Pacific Trust Life letterhead, dated 4 days ago, confirming that the insurance claim had been approved for disbursement, 24万美元, already approved, already, in the language of the letter, pending final transfer to the designated account, which meant they had not come this morning to begin the process. They had come because the process was nearly finished, and they needed my signature on the house documents before I understood that the money was already gone. I set down my tea. I went to the drawer beneath the cutlery, and I took out my notebook and I wrote the date at the top of a new page. Then I wrote 2 words beneath it. Not yet. Clara Pham's office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old wood and air conditioning, and the particular stillness of a place where serious things are decided quietly. I arrived at 8 exactly. She was already at her desk when her assistant showed me in a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a legal pad covered in handwriting so dense it looked like a field of grass. She stood when I entered, shook my hand with the grip of someone who has learned that firmness communicates respect rather than aggression, and gestured to the chair across from her. I sat. I placed my folder on the desk between us. I had organized everything the way I had organized patient charts for 34 years chronologically, with a summary page on top, listing each item and the date it was acquired. Clara looked at the summary page first. She read it without speaking. Then she opened the folder and began going through the documents one by one, slowly, in the same silence. I let her read. Outside the window, the city was beginning its morning. Motorcycles on the street below, the sound rising and falling in waves. Someone was selling something from a cart. I could hear the periodic call of it. 3 syllables repeating, too muffled by the glass to make out the words, but rhythmic in the way of things that have been said so many times they have become almost musical. The handwritten note, Clara said finally. She had reached Edward's page from the bedside notebook. She was looking at it with the careful attention of someone reading a document that is both evidence and something more than evidence. This is your husband's left-hand writing. Yes, his right hand had weakened by then. And the date he wrote it 1 month after the beneficiary change was supposedly signed. 1 month after, which means he was already suspicious by then. He had invited Raymond Cho to the house 9 months ago, before any of this, trying to understand what was being proposed. And then something made him stop. Something made him write that note. Clara set the page down carefully. She looked at me. Mrs. Nguyen, she said, I need to show you something. She opened the drawer on the right side of her desk and removed a manila envelope. She set it on top of my folder. I received this yesterday afternoon, she said. By courier. The sender was a man named Raymond Cho. I looked at the envelope. Raymond Cho sent this to you, I said. He sent it to my office, yes. He did not include a cover letter, only the contents. She paused. I believe he is frightened. I believe he has understood, in the past several days, that he is the most exposed person in this arrangement and that the people who involved him are not going to protect him if this unravels. She opened the envelope and laid its contents on the desk in front of me. There were 4 items. The first was a photocopy of a bank transfer record. The transfer was dated 11 months ago, 2 months before the beneficiary change form had been submitted, 1 month before Raymond Cho's first text message to Edward. The amount was $8,500, transferred from an account in the name of Vivian Nguyen to an account I did not recognize, annotated in the transfer notes as consulting services, $8,500. The same figure Daniel had found in Vivian's bank records. But that was not what stopped my breath. The second item was a letter. Handwritten, 2 pages, in a script I did not recognize, careful, small, the writing of someone who had taken time with each word. Raymond Cho's letter to Clara, explaining what had happened. I did not read it then. I read the third item first, because Clara had placed it on top and her expression when she did so had told me it was the one that mattered most. It was a photograph. Taken, according to the timestamp in the corner, at 11:47 inches the morning on March 14th. It showed the interior of a small office fluorescent light, a desk, a notary seal visible at the corner of the frame. 2 people were standing at the desk. One was Raymond Cho, younger looking in the photograph than I had imagined him, his expression arranged carefully into something that wanted to look neutral and did not quite manage it. The other person was Marcus, my son. He was standing beside Raymond Cho with a pen in his hand, leaning over the desk, signing a document. His face was turned slightly toward the camera, not posed, not aware of being photographed. The expression on his face was the one I had seen in the kitchen 3 days ago, when he had looked at the table instead of at me. Not guilt, but the face of a man performing an action he has decided not to examine. The fourth item was a single folded paper. A copy of the beneficiary change form, not the official version I had seen at Pacific Trust Life's office, but a working draft, with handwritten notes in the margins. The notes were in 2 different hands. One I did not recognize, one I did. Edward's handwriting. Left-handed, wide-spaced, the letters large and deliberate. In the margin beside the beneficiary field, beside the name Vivian Nguyen, typed in the draft, Edward had written 3 words. I did not sign. I sat in Clara Pham's office on the 4th floor of that quiet building, and I looked at my husband's handwriting, and I understood what it had cost him to write those 3 words. How much clarity it had required, in those final difficult weeks, to pick up a pen with a hand that no longer worked well, and press those words into paper, to make a record, to leave something behind for whoever came looking. He had known. Not suspected, known. He had discovered what Vivian and Marcus were planning, and he had not been able to stop it, not directly. Not in the state his body had reached by then, not without help he did not know how to ask for, without frightening me before he had anything solid to show. And so he had done what he could. He had written things down. He had left the note about Raymond Cho. He had told me where the original policy was kept. He had said, if anything happens with the policy, go to the office yourself. He had been building a case. Quietly. Methodically. In the last weeks of his life, with a weakened hand and a mind that was still entirely his own, my husband had been gathering what he could, and placing it where I would find it. He had trusted me to look. I had not known I was looking until I was already 3 steps into it. I pressed my hand flat on the photograph, on the image of my son signing my husband's name, on a document that was never his to sign, in a room Edward could not reach, on a day when Edward lay in a hospital bed, unable to hold a cup, and I sat with that for a long moment. Not with anger. Not yet. With grief first. The particular grief of a woman who has spent 41 years building something with another person, a house, a family, a life with weight and texture, and the accumulated meaning of ordinary days, and who is sitting now in an office on a Tuesday morning looking at the photograph of the place where it began to be dismantled. Then the anger arrived. It was not loud. It was not the anger of a woman who has been surprised. It was the anger of a woman who has confirmed what she already knew, and who has now finished grieving the confirmation, and is ready to do something with it. It had the quality of a door closing, not slamming, simply closing, with a firm and final click. He left me everything I needed, I said. My voice was steady. Clara was watching me with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to speak during the moments when another person is arriving somewhere important. He always did, I said. I just needed to know where to look. Clara nodded slowly. She picked up her legal pad. Mrs. Nguyen, she said, I'd like to talk about next steps, because what we have in front of us now is not a civil matter. What we have is evidence of document forgery, insurance fraud, and criminal conspiracy involving at minimum 3 people. She set her pen down. Your son is in that photograph. I know, I said. How would you like to proceed? I looked at the photograph one more time. At Marcus's face, turned slightly toward the camera. at the pen in his hand, at the expression of a man who had decided not to examine what he was doing. Then I looked at Edward's 3 words in the margin of the draft form. I did not sign. "Tell me everything we can do," I said. "All of it. Leave nothing out." Clara picked up her pen, and outside the window, the city continued its morning indifferent and unhurried, moving at its own pace, the way cities do, the way rivers do, the way justice does when it has finally decided to stop being patient and begin. I have prepared patients for surgery, not the cutting that was never my role, but the before. The hours of careful, methodical preparation that make the difference between a procedure that goes cleanly and one that does not. Checking vital signs, reviewing charts, confirming allergies, laying out instruments in the correct order so that when the moment arrives, nothing is missing and nothing is in the wrong place. The surgeon gets the credit. The nurse builds the foundation the surgeon stands on. I understood, leaving Clara's office that Tuesday morning, that I was in the preparation phase. The surgery would come later. I did not go home directly. I took the long way, walked 3 blocks to the small park near the old market, the one with the concrete benches and the flame tree that shed red blossoms onto the path every dry season. I sat on a bench and watched the blossoms for a while. And I let myself be still, because stillness was not the same as inaction. And I had learned long ago that the mind does its best work when the body stops moving. Clara had given me a list. Not written, she had not put it on paper because paper could be found. She had spoken it clearly, once, in the precise way of someone who trusts that the person across the desk is capable of retaining what matters. First, do not sign anything that arrives, regardless of who delivers it or what reason accompanies it. Second, maintain ordinary behavior. Keep to my routines. Answer calls from Marcus and Vivian as I normally would. Say nothing that suggested I had met with Clara, or that I had seen what Raymond Cho had sent. Third, Dr. Albert Tran's written statement was being finalized and would be ready by Thursday. I was to collect it in person, not have it mailed. Fourth, Clara was filing an emergency application with the Insurance Regulatory Authority to pause the disbursement of the $240,000 pending investigation. This was not guaranteed to succeed. The approval had already been processed, but the filing itself would create a legal record that complicated any further action on Vivian's part. Fifth, I was not to tell Daniel, not yet. Not because he was untrustworthy, but because his reactions were not within my control, and uncontrolled reactions at this stage could disturb the water before we were ready. I sat with the list in my mind and the flame tree above me, and the red blossoms falling at intervals onto the concrete path, and I thought about each item in turn. Then I stood up, straightened my blouse, and went home. The first thing I did when I got back was go to the kitchen and make a proper meal. Rice, braised fish, the soup with young tamarind leaves that Edward had always requested when he wanted something comforting. I cooked it all, ate alone at the kitchen table, washed the dishes, and put them away. Routine is its own form of discipline. It tells the body that the mind is still in charge. After that, I went to the altar room. I did not light incense. I simply stood in front of the shelf and looked at Edward's photograph. And I spoke to him the way I had spoken to him every evening of our marriage, not with ceremony, just with the plain words of one person talking to another, across whatever distance now existed between us. I told him what I had found. What Clara had shown me. What Raymond Cho's photograph had confirmed. I told him that I had read his 3 words in the margin I did not sign, and that I understood now what he had been trying to do in those final weeks, and that it had worked, and that I was going to finish what he had started. I told him I was not angry at him for not telling me directly. I had thought about this on the bench in the park, and I understood it. He had been trying to protect me from something he could not prove yet. He had been gathering what he could gather, placing things where I would find them, trusting that I would know what to do when the time came. That was exactly what I would have done in his position. We had always thought alike. 41 years of parallel thinking. I reached behind the photograph and felt the envelope. Still there. Cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. I did not take it out. Not yet. The envelope was the final piece, the original policy with my name as sole beneficiary, in Edward's careful hand and Pacific Trust Life's official typeface. I had confirmed its existence with my fingers every day since the morning he died, but I had not opened it because some things should only be opened when the moment is exactly right, when opening them will have the maximum possible effect. I had been a nurse for 34 years. I knew something about timing. Over the next 3 days, I moved carefully. I returned Vivian's call on Wednesday evening. She had called that afternoon. A brief message, friendly in the way of someone who believes a transaction is already completed and is simply waiting for the final signatures. I told her I had been reviewing the documents Mr. Anthony Liu had left, that I had some questions about the wording and would like to discuss them next week. She said, of course, take all the time you need, her voice smooth with the confidence of someone who has mistaken patience for weakness and cannot yet tell the difference. I collected Albert Tran's written statement on Thursday morning. He handed it to me in a sealed envelope with his clinic's letterhead on the front and his signature across the seal. 4 pages, he said. Everything documented. Dates, observations, the precise clinical assessment of Edward's right-hand motor function during and after his March hospitalization, and his professional opinion stated in the careful language of a doctor who has chosen his words to be unambiguous in court, that Edward Nguyen could not have signed a legal document on March 14th. I thanked him. He looked at me across his desk with the expression of a man who has known me for 11 years and has chosen now to say something he has been considering for some time. Hazel, he said, Edward told me something in one of his last appointments. He said, he paused, arranged his words. He said that you were the most capable person he had ever known, and that he was sorry he hadn't said it enough. And then, he said he was going to make sure you had everything you needed. I sat with that for a moment. He did, I said. He made sure. I placed Albert's envelope in the folder with the others. By Thursday evening, the folder contained the original policy photocopy, Edward's handwritten note. The text message records between Edward and Raymond Cho, the photograph from Raymond Cho's package, showing Marcus at the notary desk, the bank transfer record showing Vivian's payment to Raymond Cho, Albert Tran's clinical statement, and Clara's preliminary filing confirmation from the Insurance Regulatory Authority. 8 items, each one a separate instrument. Together, they were something else entirely. I placed the folder in the drawer beneath the cutlery. On top of it, I placed a plain white envelope containing a single sheet of paper, the note I had written that morning in the park, while a flame tree dropped blossoms onto the path around me. The note listed the names of everyone who should receive a copy of the folder's contents, in the order they should receive them, and the dates by which Clara intended to act. I locked the drawer with the small key I kept on my keychain, between the house key and the key to Edward's old filing cabinet. Then I went to the altar room for the last time that evening, and I stood in front of the shelf, and I said goodnight to Edward the way I had said goodnight to him for 41 years. Simply, without ceremony, the way you speak to someone who knows you well enough that the words are almost beside the point. Tomorrow, Clara would make 3 phone calls. 1 to the Insurance Regulatory Authority, to confirm the status of the emergency filing. 1 to the District Office of Pacific Trust Life, to formally request the notarization logbook for March 14th. 1 to the Office of the Financial Crimes Unit, to submit Raymond Cho's package, along with Clara's accompanying legal brief, and I would make 1 of my own. Not to Vivian. Not to Marcus. To Mr. Anthony Liu, the estate attorney with the leather briefcase. I would tell him I had reviewed the documents he had left, that I was ready to meet, that I had some things I would like to discuss before any signatures were provided. I would ask him to arrange a meeting that included everyone. Vivian, Marcus, Vivian's own attorney, if she wished, everyone in the same room, because some things should only be done once, and they should be done completely, and they should be witnessed by the people who most need to understand what they are seeing. The flame tree in the park had been shedding blossoms for 3 days. The dry season does not announce its end. It simply arrives, and the rain begins, and everything that was waiting in the dry becomes clear. I went to bed that night at 9 o'clock, and I slept without interruption for the first time since Edward died. Tomorrow, the rain would begin. The meeting was held in Mr. Anthony Liu's office. I had suggested it. Neutral ground. I told him not my house, not Vivian's, somewhere with a conference table and enough chairs for everyone who needed to be present. He had agreed readily, which told me he still believed he was managing the situation, that the elderly widow had reviewed the documents, found them overwhelming, and was requesting a meeting because she needed someone to explain things to her slowly. I arrived 10 minutes early. Clara Pham arrived 2 minutes after me. She sat to my left, set her legal case on the table, and did not open it. She had told me the night before that she would follow my lead entirely, that this was my meeting, my moment, and her role was to be present and to speak only when I indicated she should. I had thanked her for understanding. Vivian and Marcus arrived together. Vivian wore the pale stone silk blouse again, the same one from the Saturday morning visit. I noticed this and filed it away without comment. Marcus looked as he had looked for the past 2 weeks, a man carrying something he had not set down long enough to examine. He saw Clara and slowed his step. Slightly. Just slightly. But I saw it. Mr. Anthony Liu sat at the head of the table. He introduced everyone with the practiced ease of a man who conducts difficult family meetings regularly and has learned that formality creates the impression of neutrality. He did not look at Clara's legal case. Vivian's lawyer, a man named Stephen Bowie, who was younger than I expected and quieter, sat beside her with a leather portfolio open in front of him. Mrs. Nguyen, Mr. Anthony Liu began, "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I understand you had some questions about the documents we left with you." "Yes," I said. "I did. I had brought one thing with me. Not the folder. Not the 8 items Clara and I had assembled over the past week. Not the photographs. Not the medical records. Not the bank transfer evidence. Those existed, and they would be used, but not by me, not today. Clara had those. That was her work, and it was already in motion. What I had brought was a plain envelope. The same one that had been sitting behind Edward's photograph on the altar shelf for 19 years. The one I had not opened on the morning he died, because I had not been ready. The one I had touched every day since, confirming it was still there, waiting. I placed it on the table in front of me. Vivian's eyes went to it immediately. I watched her look at it, the faded brown of the paper, the small water stain at one corner from a year when the rainy season had come in through the altar room window before we sealed the frame. She looked at it the way you look at something that you cannot immediately identify, but that gives you, for reasons you cannot name, a feeling of unease. "Good. Before we discuss the documents Mr. Liu prepared," I said, "I'd like to discuss a different document." I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded paper, thick, formal, with the Pacific Trust Life logo across the top and the careful typography of something printed 19 years ago, when that particular logo was slightly different from the one the company used now. I unfolded it and smoothed it flat on the table. Policy number PT1987HN. Policyholder, Edward Nguyen. Primary beneficiary, Hazel Nguyen. Sole. No secondary beneficiary listed. Effective date, 19 years ago. Signed by Edward in the particular script I had known for over 40 years, the capital N tilting upward at the end, reaching for something. Witnessed and stamped by Pacific Trust Life at policy inception. Valid. Original, unaltered. The room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of a meeting in progress, the other kind. The kind that happens when something has been placed in front of people that they cannot immediately find words to address. Vivian's eyes moved from the document to me, then back to the document. Her lawyer, Stephen Bowie, leaned forward very slightly. "That's the original policy," I said. "The one Edward took out 19 years ago, when Daniel was born and he was thinking about the future. He kept it himself. He knew where it was. He told me where it was, and he told me to go there first if anything happened." I smoothed the paper once more with the flat of my hand. "My name has been on this policy for 19 years. I was the only beneficiary he ever designated." Mr. Anthony Liu cleared his throat. "Mrs. Nguyen, we acknowledge that the original policy, the beneficiary change form submitted to Pacific Trust Life 8 months ago, bears a signature that is not my husband's. I did not raise my voice. I kept it at the same level it had been since I entered the room. My husband was hospitalized on the date that form was notarized. His attending physician, Dr. Albert Tran, has provided a written clinical statement confirming that Edward's right-hand motor function was severely impaired during that period, and that he could not have produced a valid signature. That statement is with my attorney." Vivian's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The silk blouse didn't move. She was very controlled. I had always known she was controlled. But control is a performance, and performances have edges, and I had spent 34 years watching for the place where the performance ends and the real thing begins. Furthermore, I said, the notarization logbook from Pacific Trust Life's district office records the name of the witness present on March 14th. That name, and a photograph taken at the district office on that date, are also with my attorney, along with bank records showing a transfer of $8,500 from a private account to Raymond Cho, the insurance agent who processed the claim, 2 months before the form was submitted. Marcus made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, low and involuntary, the kind a person makes when something lands that they have been bracing for without fully believing would arrive. I looked at him. He looked back at me, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes did not go to the floor. They stayed on my face, and in them I saw something I recognized, not guilt exactly, but the near neighbor of it. The look of a person who has just fully understood, for the first time, that the thing they did cannot be undone and is now visible to someone whose opinion of them was, once, the thing they valued most in the world. Marcus, I said quietly. He said nothing. I looked back at the original policy on the table. At my name, typed there 19 years ago by a woman in a Pacific Trust Life office who had no idea she was doing anything other than processing a routine form. Hazel Nguyen, Seoul. And then I said the thing I had been waiting to say since the afternoon Vivian had stood in my living room in front of Edward's altar and told me that maybe he had known I would not be around much longer, that maybe he had wanted to make sure the money stayed in the family. My husband knew exactly what he wanted, I said. He knew from the first day he took out this policy, and he never changed his mind. Not in 19 years. Not in the last weeks of his life. Not ever. I folded my hands on the table. He did not need to protect the money from me. He built our life with me. And when he understood that someone was trying to take what he had spent 41 years building, he left me every single thing I needed to stop it. Vivian opened her mouth. She closed it. For the first time since she had walked into my house 3 weeks ago and told me that maybe I would not be around much longer, she had nothing to say. I turned to Clara. Miss Pham, I said. Clara opened her legal case. She placed the folder on the table, all 8 items, organized exactly as I had arranged them, in the order that would be most difficult to answer. The photograph of Marcus at the notary desk, Albert Tran's clinical statement, the bank transfer records, Raymond Cho's letter, the text messages between Edward and Raymond Cho, the notarization logbook copy, the insurance regulatory authority filing, confirmation, and on top of all of it, Edward's 3 words, written in his careful left-hand script on a page torn from his bedside notebook. I did not sign. Mr. Anthony Liu looked at the folder, then at Clara, then at Vivian's lawyer, Stephen Bui, who had closed his leather portfolio and was looking at the table with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating the terms of his involvement. I'll give you time to review the materials, Clara said pleasantly. I should mention that copies have already been submitted to the Insurance Regulatory Authority, the District Financial Crimes Unit, and Pacific Trust Life's Compliance Office. The emergency filing to pause disbursement of the claim is already on record. She paused. The originals are with my office. Vivian's hand moved to the table. Her fingers rested on the surface, and I saw them press down slightly, a small unconscious pressure. The body looking for something solid when the ground has shifted. I looked at her hand. Then I looked at her face. She had come into my home and told me my husband had decided I would not be around much longer. She had sat in my living room, in front of Edward's photograph, and said that with her careful voice and her pressed silk blouse, because she had looked at me and seen a woman who was old, and grieving, and alone, and had decided that those 3 things together meant powerless. She had been wrong about all of it. I picked up the original policy, folded it along its 19-year crease, and placed it back in the envelope. I'll be keeping this, I said. The week after the meeting in Mr. Anthony Liu's office, things move the way things move when the foundation has already shifted and the structure above it is only beginning to understand what that means. I did not rush any of it. I went home that afternoon and cooked a proper meal. Rice, the braised fish again, the young tamarind soup. I ate at the kitchen table with the window open and the frangipani scent coming through in the late afternoon air, and I listened to the neighborhood sounds, motorcycles, a neighbor's television, the woman 2 houses down, who always talked loudly on her phone in the early evening, and I let the ordinary world settle around me like something I had not fully appreciated until recently. Clara called at 7. Vivian's attorney made contact this afternoon, she said. Stephen Bowie withdrew from the case. Conflict of interest. He discovered that some of the documents he was asked to prepare were based on the fraudulent beneficiary change. He's not willing to continue representing her. How did she take that? I have no information on that specifically, Clara said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has information and has chosen not to share it. What I can tell you is that she will need new legal representation, and that the timeline for that will work in our favor. After we hung up, I went to the altar room. I lit incense, 3 sticks, sandalwood, and I stood in the smoke, and I told Edward that things were moving, that he had built well, that the pieces were holding. The first fracture between them happened 3 days later. Daniel called me on a Thursday evening. He had been in contact with Marcus. They had spoken twice since the meeting, he said, conversations that had apparently grown progressively less contained. Daniel reported this to me carefully, the way he reported most things, factually, with an awareness that facts carry more weight than interpretation. Marcus, Daniel said, had told Vivian that he had not understood the full extent of what the plan involved when he agreed to act as witness at the notary office. That he had been told by Vivian it was a standard administrative update, a formality that needed to be handled before Edward's condition made communication more difficult. That he had not known the signature beside his witness line was not his father's. Do you believe him? I asked. A long pause. I think, Daniel said slowly, that Marcus is a man who is very good at not asking questions when the answers would be inconvenient. Whether that constitutes not knowing or choosing not to know, he stopped. I don't know, Mom. I honestly don't know. I thought about Marcus's face in the conference room, the way his eyes had finally stayed on mine instead of moving to the floor, the sound he had made, that low, involuntary sound when the weight of what was visible could no longer be minimized. What did Vivian say? I asked. When he told her that, he said she told him that he had signed the form, that his signature was in the logbook, that it didn't matter what he thought he had or hadn't understood, the record said what it said, and they had to present a unified position. Another pause, and then Marcus asked her directly whether she had known the original signature on the beneficiary form was forged, whether she had known all along that Dad hadn't actually signed it, and? She didn't answer him. The silence that followed that statement had a particular shape. The shape of a man who had asked a direct question and received, in the absence of an answer, the only answer that mattered. He's going to cooperate with the investigation, Daniel said. He called Clara's office this afternoon. He wants to provide a statement. I sat with that for a long moment. My firstborn son. The one who had stood at a notary desk and witnessed something he should have refused. Who had sat at my kitchen table and told me everything was legal and properly filed, without meeting my eyes. Who had been, for months, the instrument of something he had perhaps not fully designed but had not refused to serve. He was not blameless. I did not think he was blameless. But he was my son, and he had, in the end, asked the question that needed to be asked, and when the answer came back as silence, he had made a different choice than the one he had made before. Tell him, I said to Daniel, that what he does now is what will matter. Not just in court. In how he lives afterward. Daniel said he would. The regulatory investigation moved faster than Clara had expected. Raymond Cho, it emerged, had been cooperating since the day he sent his package to Clara's office. He provided a complete account: the initial approach from Vivian, the negotiated payment, the arrangement to visit my house on a Thursday morning, and the subsequent discovery that Edward had grown suspicious and stopped responding to his messages. He provided documentation of every communication. He confirmed that the signature on the beneficiary change form had been produced by Vivian, not by Edward, in his presence, on the morning of March 14th, while Edward lay in a hospital bed across the city. Vivian's new attorney, a man named Gordon Lamb, older than Stephen Bowie, and considerably less willing to accept the situation at face value, reviewed the full file and told her, according to what Clara later relayed to me, that the evidentiary position was not one he could construct a defense around. That cooperation with the investigation was the only viable path toward any form of reduced consequences. Vivian declined initially. She maintained for 11 days after the meeting in Mr. Anthony Liu's office that the beneficiary change had been legitimate. That Edward had expressed his intentions to her and Marcus in private conversations. That the medical records were being misinterpreted. That Raymond Cho was a disgruntled former agent attempting to deflect his own culpability. On the 12th day, the Insurance Regulatory Authority formally referred the case to the Financial Crimes Unit. The referral included Raymond Cho's full cooperation agreement, Marcus's statement, Albert Tran's clinical report, the bank transfer records, the notarization logbook, and the photograph taken at the district office on March 14th. Clara told me about the referral in a phone call on a Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen when she called. The kettle had just boiled. Outside, the frangipani tree was doing what it always did, keeping its own time, dropping its blossoms at the intervals it had decided upon without consulting anyone. What happens to Vivian now? I asked. Insurance fraud, document forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Clara's voice was even and informational. The Financial Crimes Unit will determine the specific charges, but the evidentiary record is comprehensive. Gordon Lamb will almost certainly advise her to cooperate at this stage. The alternative is a trial with a very clear paper trail and 2 cooperating witnesses. And the money? The $240,000? The disbursement was paused by the emergency filing before the transfer completed. The funds are held pending the investigation. Once the original policy is confirmed as the valid document, and it will be confirmed, Mrs. Nguyen, the original always supersedes a fraudulent amendment. The claim will be reprocessed in your name. I poured my tea. Outside, a frangipani blossom detached from the tree and floated down slowly, turning once in the air before it reached the ground. And Vivian knew that, I said. When she sat in my living room and told me my husband might have changed his mind because he expected I wouldn't be around much longer. She knew he had not changed his mind. She knew my name was still on the original. She knew all of it. Yes, Clara said simply, she knew all of it. I thought about the afternoon Vivian had said those words. The pale stone silk blouse, the practiced smile, the careful selection of each phrase. Maybe he knew you wouldn't be around much longer either. And she had looked at me with the complete confidence of someone who has already finished a thing and is merely observing the aftermath. She had looked at a retired nurse in her late 60s, recently widowed, living alone in an old house with an altar and a frangipani tree, and she had seen someone who could be managed. Someone who would be too tired, too grief-fogged, too trusting, too far past her useful years to look carefully at what was being done around her. She had looked at still water and not understood what still water can do. Clara, I said. Yes? When this is finished, when the claim is reprocessed, when the legal matters are resolved, I want to do something with a portion of the money. A donation to an organization that assists elderly people dealing with financial exploitation. I want it done properly, documented, in Edward's name. A brief pause. That's a very good use of it, Clara said. Edward would have thought so, I said. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The frangipani tree moved in a small wind, its branches catching the morning light the way they always had, indifferent and unhurried and entirely their own. On the 12th day after the referral was filed, Vivian Nguyen agreed to cooperate with the financial crimes investigation. I was not surprised. Certainty is a kind of armor, and armor only works until it meets something harder than itself. Vivian had been certain from the beginning, certain that I was manageable, certain that the paperwork was complete, certain that an old woman in an old house had nothing left that could threaten what she had decided to take. She had been wrong about all of it. And now she was learning the only lesson that certainty, broken, ever actually teaches, that the cost of being wrong is always paid in full, and it is always paid alone. I washed my teacup. I put it away. And I went to the altar room, and I lit 3 sticks of sandalwood incense, and I watched the smoke find its shape in the afternoon light the way it always did, curling upward, patient and unhurried, exactly as it had always been. One more day, one more chapter, and then, finally, the rest of whatever came next. The insurance check arrived on a Wednesday morning. I was in the altar room when I heard the mail slot open and close. I finished what I was doing, first replacing the incense, straightening the small ceramic water cup, taking a moment to look at Edward's photograph in the particular way I had looked at it every morning since he died. not with grief exactly, but with the kind of attention you give to something you want to remember accurately. The way he had looked at 61, before the illness. The way his face held, even in a photograph, the quality of a man who was genuinely interested in whatever was in front of him. Then I went to collect the mail. The envelope was from Pacific Trust Life, thick, cream-colored, with the company's logo in the upper left corner, and my name Hazel Nguyen typed in the address field with the clean precision of an official document that has been processed correctly and knows it. I set it on the kitchen table. I made tea first. I had learned, over 68 years, that the moments worth having are worth approaching unhurried. That the woman who stops to make tea before opening the envelope that ends a 4-month legal battle is the woman who will remember the moment clearly, rather than the woman who tears it open in the hallway and spends the rest of the day unable to recall what the kitchen smelled like or what the light was doing or whether the frangipani tree was moving in the wind. It was moving, gently, from the east. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter on company letterhead, 3 paragraphs, formal and precise, confirming that following the completion of the regulatory investigation and the validation of policy number PT1987HN, the life insurance claim had been reprocessed in the name of the original sole primary beneficiary. The funds, $240,000, had been transferred to the account I had designated in Clara's office 2 weeks earlier. Beneath the letter was a single additional page, an official correction notice, stating that the beneficiary change form submitted 8 months ago had been determined to be fraudulent and had been removed from the policy record, that the original designation stood, that it had always stood. I read both pages once. Then I folded them along their creases and placed them in the small teak box on my bedroom dresser, beside our marriage certificate and the children's birth records and the photocopy of the policy I had made 19 years ago, because I was a woman who believed in keeping copies of important things. I called Clara. It arrived, I said. Good. A pause, and in it I heard the particular satisfaction of a person who has done a thing well and is allowing herself one quiet moment to know it. How are you? I'm all right, I said. And I meant it in the plain way, not performed, not managed, just accurate. I was all right. Not unchanged. Not the same woman who had stood in her living room 4 months ago and listened to Vivian say what she had said in front of Edward's altar, but all right. That afternoon I went to see Daniel. He had extended his stay from Singapore by 3 weeks, and then another 2, and now it had been 2 months, and neither of us had said directly that this was what it was my son, choosing to be present, the way the other one had not. We met at a small restaurant near his rented room, the kind of place with plastic chairs and ceiling fans and food that was very good and made no attempt to appear otherwise. We ate together without discussing the case, without discussing Marcus, who had submitted his full cooperation statement and was navigating his own consequences in the care of his own attorney, in a process that was no longer mine to manage, without discussing Vivian, who had entered a cooperation agreement and whose legal outcomes were now entirely in the hands of people and institutions equipped to handle them. We talked about other things. Daniel's work, his plans, whether he might consider a position that kept him closer to home, the restaurant's fish, which was very good, a memory he had of Edward taking them both to a market on a Saturday morning when they were young, the way their father had moved through a crowd unhurried, attentive, interested in everything. He never seemed to be in a hurry, Daniel said. He wasn't, I said. He believed that things done slowly and correctly outlasted things done quickly and carelessly. He built his whole life on that. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he built you into it. The way he left those things for you to find. He knew you'd look. He knew you'd know what to do. I thought about the note in the bedside notebook. The text messages he had kept. The envelope behind the photograph. The 3 words written in careful left-hand script. He had known me for 41 years. Of course he had known. Yes, I said. He trusted me. 3 weeks later, I made the donation. Clara had helped me arrange a contribution to an organization that provided legal assistance and advocacy to elderly people facing financial exploitation. The work they did was the kind that happened quietly, in offices and courtrooms and phone calls. The kind that most people never saw until they needed it and were grateful it existed. Edward's name was on the donation record. Hazel and Edward Nguyen, in memory of a life built together. It was not a large portion of the total. I was not a woman who believed in grand gestures. I kept what I needed to live well and without anxiety, and I gave what felt right, and the arithmetic of that was between me and whatever remained of Edward in the things he had left behind. The morning after I finalized the donation, I woke before 5. I lay still for a while, listening to the house. It was the same house, same floorboards, same window that fogged in the same corner in winter, same frangipani tree in the side yard. I had considered, briefly, whether to move. Had thought about it in the way you think about things after they have been tested, not running from them, but asking honestly whether they still fit. The house fit. It was mine, fully and without contest, and it held what it had always held. 31 years of a life built by two people who had known exactly what they were building and had meant every piece of it. I got up, made tea, went to the altar room. The incense caught on the second match. 3 sticks, sandalwood, the kind Edward had preferred. The smoke rose in the early morning stillness and found its shape, that slow curl upward, unhurried, going exactly where it intended to go without announcing the direction in advance. I stood in front of Edward's photograph for a long time. I told him about the check, about Daniel staying, about the donation in his name, about the way Clara had shaken my hand at our last meeting with the grip that communicated respect, and how I had understood, for the first time in a long time, that the word capable had never stopped being accurate, that it had only been briefly, and unsuccessfully, challenged. I told him I missed him, that I would always miss him. That missing someone and continuing to live were not opposites but companions, and that I had learned this from nursing, and relearned it from grief, and would probably need to learn it again in the years ahead, the way you relearn things that matter. And then I stood in the smoke of the sandalwood incense, in the house we had built together. In the early morning quiet that was mine again, entirely, simply, correctly mine, and I thought about something my mother had said. She had said it in the evenings when she thought my sister and I were asleep, her voice coming through the thin wall between rooms like something meant for the night air rather than for daughters who were awake and listening. The river does not announce itself before it reaches the sea. It simply moves and arrives. I had been moving for 4 months. Through the phone call from Linda Pham, through the notarization logbook, through Clara's office, and the conference room table, and the envelope I had carried in my hands and placed on polished wood in front of people who had believed I was finished. I had arrived. Not at wealth, the money was what Edward had always intended it to be, practical and purposeful, not a prize, not at victory in any loud sense, at something quieter and more durable than that, at the simple truth that a woman of 68, who has spent a life paying careful attention, who has learned to keep copies of important things, and to know where envelopes are kept, and to wait for the right moment before opening them, that woman is not still water because she has nothing left. She is still water because she has learned, over a long and well-lived life, exactly how much force is held in stillness. I looked at Edward's photograph one more time, at the smile that started at the left corner, at the face of a man who had known me for 41 years and had trusted, without hesitation, that I would look and find and finish what needed finishing. He was right. He was always right about the things that mattered. Still water gives no warning before it breaks the dam. If anyone has ever looked at you and seen only your age, your grief, or your silence, and decided that meant you were finished, this story is for you. The ones who raised families, built lives, and held everything together with quiet hands are never as fragile as people assume. Still water runs deeper than anyone expects, and it always finds its way. If Hazel's story moved you, please give this video a like, and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them belongs to someone who refused to give up. In the comments, tell us, if you were in Hazel's position, what is the one thing you would have done differently, and what do you think gave her the strength to stay silent for so long before she acted?